Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. My name is Mike Sosolsky, and I serve as Provost at Wofford College. Tonight, Wofford's Hipp Center for National Security and Foreign Policy is pleased to welcome Major Garrett back to campus as part of its lecture series on international affairs and national security. Founded in the year 2011, the Hipp Lecture Series is designed to create signature events on campus. Such events are made possible through the generous support of Wofford alumnus Van D. Hipp Jr., class of 1982. Van Hipp is chairman of American Defense International Incorporated, a Washington, D.C. based consulting firm specializing in government affairs, business development, and public relations. First, I just want to say a couple quick words about Mr. Van Hipp because he's very special to us at Wofford. He has served during his career as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army, Principal Deputy General Counsel of the Navy, an officer in the U.S. Army on active duty in both Operation Desert Storm and Operation Restore Democracy. Van has been chairman of the South Carolina Republican Party and is a renowned speaker on defense issues at forums across the country. He is an analyst on multiple networks on matters of national defense and international policy. He is also the author of the 2015 book titled The New Terrorism: How to Fight It and How to Defeat It. In 2014, Van Hipp was the recipient of Wofford's Distinguished Service Award, and of special interest to everyone here, I know, he is the sideline reporter for Wofford football, so go Terriers. Van's passion has been to invite speakers to our campus and community who will capture the attention of students and the public and draw them into important conversations on applying American leadership and ideals to the challenges of international affairs. So Van, we would just like you to stand for a second and let us thank you for your service to our nation and for all you do for Wofford College. Van, where are you? There you are. And now I'd like to say a word about our guest of honor this evening. Major Garrett was named CBS News Chief Washington, D.C. Correspondent in December of 2018. As Chief Washington Correspondent, Garrett reports for all CBS News broadcasts and platforms. His talk tonight is based on his latest book entitled Mr. Trump's Wild Ride: The Thrills, Chills, Screams, and Occasional Blackouts of an Extraordinary Presidency. A reception and book signing will follow tonight's event in the lobby, and books will be available for purchase. Back to his biography. From 2012 until 2018, Mr. Garrett served as CBS Network's chief White House correspondent. While covering the White House for CBS News, Garrett reported extensively on the international front on presidential elections to confront presidential actions to confront ISIS, threats like Ebola, nuclear negotiations with Iran, and U.S.-European efforts to confront Russia in the standoff over Ukraine, and many more important subjects. He has traveled with various presidents to Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. In 2015 and 2016, Garrett spent 16 months on the road covering the Republican presidential campaign and both major party conventions. Garrett has since covered every major domestic and foreign policy story of the Trump administration. Before joining CBS News as chief White House correspondent, Garrett was a fixture during CBS News coverage of the 2012 presidential campaign through a partnership with the National Journal, where he was chief White House correspondent. He co-hosted that network's coverage of the 2011 South Carolina Republican primary debate held right here on the campus of Wofford College, alongside his colleague CBS Evening News anchor Scott Pelley, and he offered analysis for every 2012 general election presidential debate. Prior to working at the National Journal, Garrett was the chief White House correspondent for Fox News. During his 8 years at Fox, Garrett covered 2 presidential elections, Congress, the war in Iraq, and other major stories. Before joining the Fox News team, Garrett was a White House correspondent for CNN during the administrations of George W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Previously, he was a senior editor and congressional correspondent for U.S. News and World Report, where he reported on Congress and the impeachment of President Clinton. He was a congressional reporter for the Washington Times from 1990 to 95, and the newspaper's deputy national editor from 1995 to 1997. Now, tomorrow, please make sure that you tune in to see him anchor the CBS Nightly News at 6:30. However, that's tomorrow. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome him back to Wofford College, and I want to let you know the time will be allotted at the end of his remarks for your questions. But now, please join me as we welcome proudly Mr. Major Garrett back to Wofford.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's wonderful to be back here, and I just want to ask for one more round of applause for Van, because if it weren't for Van, that debate in 2011 that was here and focused on national security and foreign policy with all the Republicans would not have happened. If you want me to tell you that full story, raise your hand during the Q&A, and I'll tell you the full story. But another round of applause for Van. I deeply appreciate that generous introduction. I really do. What I usually do after an introduction like that is I say this. The better introduction goes about like this. Major Garrett is a semi-well-known figure in an industry with declining market share and record low credibility. That's true. And I know it. I've been in the media since 1984. When I graduated from my beloved alma mater, the University of Missouri. And I love being here because I get the feeling, a very deep feeling, an abiding feeling that you care deeply about this institution, and that matters in American life. The places that form you, the places that create you, the places that are a springboard for your life matter. I care deeply about my alma mater, the University of Missouri, and I know you care deeply about Wofford, so I deeply appreciate being here and feeling that vibration. And I want to tell you this. I've spent about 4.5 hours with your students, and they are as good as they get. The questions I got were exceptional. The level of interest, the level of analytical presentation behind the questions, the thought process, everything is deeply impressive. You have a lot to be proud of here at Wofford, and it was a great pleasure to interact with your students. I saw a news alert on my phone before I came on stage, and I think it's an interesting point to start our conversation tonight, because it's in part going to be about the media, because there's nothing that can go on in American life when you talk about politics that doesn't involve the media. So it's a news alert from my very own network. I'm sure you'll find it reassuring, as I did. Rising sea levels are on track to destroy 300 million homes by 2050. I know that makes you feel good, right? It makes you feel calm, relaxed, at ease. That's according to new research by Climate Central. China, Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand most affected. But by 2050, 300 million homes will be destroyed. That's a news alert. It comes at you. It comes at all of us. And we feel, and I get this question so often when I talk to audiences, why do things feel so either disruptive or edgy and intense, and why does the news come at us the way it does? I can't give you a completely holistic answer to that, but I can say this. News has never come at you as rapidly as it does now. You're not exposed to as much news as often as you want to be, as you are now. If you are a news consumer, meaning someone who invites news into your life, you will never be left alone. Not any hour of any day. And so you may ask yourself, what's the value of being a news consumer? If what you feel primally is the sense of invasion, the sense of being assaulted by news, and how can you find a level of balance? I'm frequently asked, Major, where do I go? Who do I believe? Who do I trust? I could, in a very self-interested way, deeply self-interested way, say, well, just come to me. Come to CBS. That's easy. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to pander, and I'm not going to be a commercial spokesman. You're either going to decide to believe the CBS News on your own or you're not. And I leave that decision to you. You measure us by what we do. You measure me by what I do day in and day out. I will just say this. For a question you may have in your mind or you may not, I'm just going to offer it to you as an observation. Because it was a consistent question I got in the various classes I went to today. Where do I go? What do I do? How do I find news I can believe in? I can't give you an absolute or even a near absolute answer to that, but I can give you one way to think about it, which is this. If from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep on any given day, the news you intentionally consume leaves you feeling happy, ratified, and comforted, you're doing it wrong. Think about that. I wrote a book that came out 13 months ago. It came out in September of 2018. Here's a pro tip in case you're ever writing a book about a big subject. Don't have that book come out the week after Bob Woodward's book on the same topic. You may ask yourself, is the Woodward industrial complex real? I'm here to tell you it is. It's very real. It's formidable, and it's like an oil tanker in the water, and you're a tugboat. And I spent more than 10 weeks drowning in the wake of Bob Woodward's book, Fear. A fine book, representative of a certain view of the Trump presidency. My book is completely different. His book sold a lot. My book didn't sell as much. But I think it has value, and I'll talk about it ever so briefly, and then I want to throw the floor open for questions, because it's been always my experience that when I'm talking, I'm not learning. And when I'm listening, I'm learning, even to questions. So I want to throw the floor open for questions in just a couple of seconds. But what did I do with my book? I tried to ask a question that I think is fundamental to this period of time in American politics, which is not whether you like or dislike the Trump presidency. I don't think that's the fundamental question. I don't. The fundamental question is, what in this time of deep like and dislike is going to be with our country after the Trump presidency, however long it lasts? What will have changed because that decision was made and he was inaugurated in January 2017? What will still be with us, whether you love every aspect of the Trump presidency or hated every aspect of the Trump presidency? And I'll give you at least 4 examples, all of them in the book, with at least a chapter devoted to them. The federal bench. I go into great detail, more than any journalist ever has, about the president's approach to filling Supreme Court vacancies. If you remember, during the campaign, he was the first ever candidate, he wasn't even a nominee yet, to create a list of potential Supreme Court nominees. I explained in vivid detail how that happened, who was involved, what was the conversation. Not the general conversation, the precise conversation, and who it was with. What effect did that have in the course of the campaign? I would say it was a profound effect, because for many Republicans who were not certain about Donald Trump, the idea that he had specified a list of potential Supreme Court nominees, that he prioritized that, was reason enough to say, that's specific, that takes an issue that I care about, and it's a distinguishing factor. I talk about immigration. We haven't changed any laws in our country, but we've dramatically changed the enforcement of the existing laws. In a complete pendulum swing from the existing laws as not enforced or selectively enforced under the Obama administration. President Trump talks about immigration differently. It's changed the context of our internal conversation, and it's changed our perception internationally on the question of immigration. A profound effect that will be with the country long after the Trump presidency, because it's either going to be replicated or it's going to be reversed. But either way, it's of profound importance. The tax code is different. I explained in vivid detail how that tax code was changed. Who were the key players? What were the main decisions? How did Trump evolve in his lobbying for tax reform from the approach he took to try to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare? That's a significant change in our economic structure, the way corporations are taxed, the way individuals are taxed, the way our economy functions. That's going to be with us for a good long time. I also talk about deregulation. Now, writing a chapter about deregulation is not the easiest thing in the world. It's certainly not the sexiest thing in the world, but it's deeply important. There are plenty of people in this country who believe the president's approach to deregulation has been more important economically to their future than taxes. How the president approached that, why he was able to do things, why he had a more ambitious agenda than Ronald Reagan did, why he was able to succeed in ways that Ronald Reagan wasn't, if you consider deregulation a success. And again, I don't argue whether you should or shouldn't. I'm agnostic on the Trump presidency, whether you like it or not. I don't play that game and I don't live in that world. Again, that's one of the reasons my book doesn't succeed, because the books that do succeed right now either hate Trump relentlessly or love Trump relentlessly. I can't do either. That's not who I am, that's not what I do. I tried to take as much of an analytical and journalistic approach to the book and these questions as I could. One factor you'll discover in the book, and it may interest you, it may be important to you, it may not be, but it was important to me. The book is on the record. There's one unattributed quote in 330 pages. One. Everything else is on the record. Named, titled, everyone identified. And there hasn't been a single contested quote in the book by anyone, under any circumstance. Why did I do that? Because I believe in these times when the president, with some frequency, calls the question, what's journalism? What's fake? What isn't? What's real? What's not? I wanted something that was verifiable for each and every reader. So if they saw something, they could go to their Google machine and say, has anyone ever contested this or argued with this or said this is incorrect? They could verify it themselves because the names are right there. The titles are right there. The quotes are right there. So that's a way that you can look at the book and judge for yourself whether it's meaningful or lasting or not. And it was also, and I will conclude by saying this, the book was my own bit of therapy. Because covering this administration up close is a pretty tumultuous thing. The metaphor often used is like if you go to an aquarium and all you ever do at the aquarium is have your nose pressed completely up against the glass. Because that's how close you are when you cover the White House, any White House. But this one, it's really close and everything feels very right up against your nose. Well, it limits your line of sight. Every day feels like it's coming at you with tremendous intensity. And I wanted to find a place for my own well-being, professionally and otherwise, to push back, to get a little bit of space from that aquarium glass. And say, okay, all this is going on, all these tweets, all this noise, all these shiny objects, what's durable? What's going to stay? What can we deduce from what's happened and what it might mean? The last thing I will say about the book is the last words I wrote for it, I wrote in July of 2018. It went to press in late September, early September of 2018. All the things I identified still hold. All the trend lines I identified have only been reinforced by what happened after that. There's only one thing missing from the book that I think is significant about the Trump presidency, because it hadn't happened yet. And that's the whole trade policy approach. I'll be happy to take any questions about that. That was unresolved in the first year of the Trump presidency, and for much of the second year of the Trump presidency. It became a very big issue in 2019. So there's only one thing about what we have lived with that matters, in my estimation, in the Trump presidency that's not in the book, and that's trade. And if I'm ever given an opportunity to write a second Mr. Trump's Wild Ride, trade will play a very big part of that. So, I've gone on longer than I thought I would. Thank you for your indulgence. Now let me please open up the floor and anyone ask a question. And you can come to the mics or I'll just listen to you. So go ahead, sir.
Thank you for the work you do. I think that people who don't sit around and wait for someone to show up or have all these missed meals and things, missed time at home, don't appreciate the kind of work that you guys do, but it is appreciated.
Thank you, sir.
I know everybody wants to talk about Trump. Me too. This is a train wreck, and nobody nobody should take their eyes off of it. But while I have the opportunity, who makes the decision and why is it made when a particular news outlet takes one event and literally stays on it 24/7, like the death of Michael Jackson or the disappearance of the Malaysian airliner or now the Trump train wreck? I sit in front of the TV sometimes and I think India and Pakistan could be having a nuclear exchange and we wouldn't hear anything about it. How do people like Callista Ward or Elise Doucette, who are out there in harm's way filing stories and their stories don't get any air? How does that happen in 50 words or less?
50 words or less, that's a great challenge there at the end. Did everyone get the gist of that question? So basically the gist of that question is, how are news decisions made, and how are news decisions that seem to have a repetitive narrative, like one story just dominates and everything else gets pushed to the side? And the examples we used were about foreign correspondents in places of peril that don't get the attention that they probably deserve objectively and don't rate. So it's a complicated question. There are a lot of dimensions to it. First of all, I would say this, on behalf of my network, just in a self-serving way, just for a second. We cover and have covered more stories about Syria and Hong Kong and Yemen than our network competitors. That's why we're number 3. Seriously. Those are bad stories. Those are hard stories. There are bloody children in Yemen. There are bloody children in Syria. Terrible refugee camps. Very negative. Hard to watch. No fun. They're important, though. We've been there. We have had more correspondents in Syria on the front lines for longer than any of our network competitors. It's not even close. We spent more time in Hong Kong because we think that story is not just important now, but it's deeply important about the entire future of China. What happens there and what doesn't happen there will tell us a lot about what China's going to look like 20 years from now. But again, that's not a high-rating story. That's not Felicity Huffman and the college admission scandal. An important story we've covered. If I were to stay here and say, well, there's no commercial component to this at all, I'd be lying to you. I'm not going to do that. The network news broadcast, and the evening news particularly, you could argue, and I wonder about this all the time, is kind of anachronistic. I mean, seriously, raise your hand if you make a point of watching the evening news of any network on any given night. Raise your hand, please. Okay, that's not bad. God bless you. But even that is less than it would have been 20 years ago. The idea that we are as a society built around the concept of sitting around 6:30 at night to have John Chancellor or David Brinkley or Walter Cronkite explain the world to us has passed. You know how I know that for sure? I have 3 children. One has graduated from college, 2 are in college. But even when the one who was graduated from college was still in college, all were either directly tuition dependent upon my career or about to be tuition dependent upon my career. And not one of them watched me on television. Now that's a pretty instructive audience sample. Okay? They need me to be employed to go to college. And they don't watch me on television. They watch me on the web, on CBSN, our digital platform. But they don't watch me on television. I mean, they literally never sat down to watch their dad on television. Okay, that's kind of instructive to me. Things are changing. The media landscape is changing. So we're all scrapping for audience share. All I can tell you is, on celebrity search, you mentioned Michael Jackson. Let me just say one thing on my own behalf. The day that Michael Jackson died, we were traveling as the White House press corps with President Obama. We happened to be in Moscow. He did what presidents frequently do at that time. At the end of a foreign trip, they'll do what they call round robin with the 5 traveling networks to take questions for 10 minutes each at the end of the foreign trip to talk about all the things that they've done. 5 networks. I happened to work working for Fox at the time. Every network but me, meaning me, asked him a question about Michael Jackson. I refused. Was not going to ask him, the President of the United States, in Moscow at the end of a multi-nation foreign policy tour, a question about Michael Jackson. One, because I knew everyone else had already asked So and a second, I just wasn't going to do it. It seemed ridiculous, non-newsy, what Barack Obama thought about Michael Jackson. Yet, everyone else did, and it became a huge part of the larger conversation. I would say this about our news industry, and I think it started in a profound way with the Bronco ride of O.J. Simpson. When the NBA Finals and the Bronco ride with A.C. Cowlings were side by side, and that story, the O.J. Simpson story, became a celebrity slash politics slash other kind of story. It dominated network news broadcasts in ways that stories like that, of which there have been many in our history, never had. And it became a ratings generator and a revenue generator. And I would also observe, to be candid, it's one of the reasons candidate Trump got a lot of time. The rules were rewritten for Donald Trump when he was a candidate. Networks that would never take a call-in, ever, for any political figure, under any circumstances, suddenly took the call-in from Donald Trump. The call-in. Didn't have to go to a studio, didn't have to wear makeup, didn't have to wear a tie, didn't have to do anything except pick up a phone. CBS did fewer than that than others, but we still did a few, more than I'm comfortable with. Why? You know why. Ratings, clicks, other things. Clicks especially, on the web. Trump's in it, people are going to read the story. They're going to come to the website. And I would argue, you didn't ask a question about Trump, but I would say that's one of the things he understood about his time and about the relative media infrastructure he was going to deal with. He knew the media infrastructure was particularly dependent on a figure who had both political or emerging political status and pre-existing celebrity status. And he maximized that in a way that nobody understood except him at the time. Because he knew the weaknesses of the media infrastructure and how dependent it was on day-to-day, hour-to-hour ratings and clicks. And he maximized that to his advantage. So our decisions can be manipulated. We're not in control as you may think we are. People can look at that and say, I'm going to do something to use that to my advantage and not theirs. And I think that's what happened in the 2016 campaign. It's a huge question you asked. That's a partial answer, I know, but it's the best I got.
Thank you.
Sure. Who's next?
Yes, sir. So I kind of have a two-parter here. The first part is there any way that you think the press can recover its credibility? As you said, it's kind of low right now. And second is, do you think that the constant availability of information has hurt the credibility of the press?
So two very interesting questions. Can it regain the credibility? Well, if I didn't think so, I wouldn't be here. Seriously. I have to believe in it. I have to believe that we have lost our ability to communicate credibly to our audience. That's the audience's verdict on us. And I don't think my industry takes that seriously enough. I don't think we pause to ask ourselves some of these structural questions. And this is a phenomenon that existed long before Donald Trump ever entered American politics. If you go back to the mid-1990s and you look at the Gallup poll, Gallup frequently asks this question on a yearly basis, and within the years it asks this question: how much do you believe or trust the mainstream media? It's a general question. And in the mid-1990s, it was about 65% for Democrats, slightly above 60% for independents, and just slightly above 50% for Republicans. And until present, it has been a steady decline, until the Trump candidacy. Steady decline, all three. Not more sharply for one than the other, all down. Democrats, independents, Republicans, all down. It's not as if only Republicans gave up, or only independents gave up, or only Democrats gave up. They all, at one level or another, followed the slope down. I don't think we spend enough time paying attention to that and understanding that there is some direct relationship between that and our market share. I mean, I said it as a joke, but it's not a joke. Record low market share and declining credibility are inextricably linked. They are not a coincidence. They are not just, oh, one happened and I guess the other, what? I don't know. How could they possibly be related? Hello, they're completely related. I don't think we've done enough soul searching about that. Plus, you've had the rise of 2 cable networks that speak specifically to theoretically aggrieved audiences who don't feel like they're getting enough space. Fox on the center right, MSNBC on the center left. And they've now built business models that are competitive against each other and competitive against the middle mainstream media, people like CBS. So we have 2 competitors that are trying to vie for the same audience we're trying to vie for. Look, it was a lot easier in the 60s and 70s when you had 3 choices. And they were essentially the same, they just differed by angle. We're a Brinkley household, we're a John Chancellor household. My household happened to be a Walter Cronkite household. We were a CBS household. But those were your choices, that was it. It was a very homogenized world. You had 3 campfires. 6:30 every night, there were 3 campfires around which you heard the story of America that night, which is what you hear at a campfire. What's the story? Well, the 3 campfires were ABC, CBS, ABC. That was it. Well, now, not only on television are there a wide variety of choices, on the web there are literally thousands. So your second question is, so I don't know if we can regain the credibility. I know we need to, and I know it's a slow process. It's literally story by story. The phrase in my business is, you're only as good as your last story. Don't tell me what you did 6 months ago, tell me what you did yesterday. If what you did yesterday is no good, then you're no good. If what you did yesterday is really good, then you're really good. But you're only as good as yesterday's story. And I've tried to make, in my career, yesterday's story better than the day before. And measure myself that way. The second question is, does the proliferation make it harder to gain credibility? Yes, it does. Because I'm frequently asked, as I said at the opening remarks, where do I go? What do I do? What do I believe? Because the choices are so varied, and they've multiplied, and will continue, and I think for a while continue to multiply. So we have more available journalism, more, and some people use the word content, I don't. Content to me is a cat video, or showing you how to play the harmonica or make a pancake. That's content. Wonderful, great. Do-it-yourself stuff, you want to fix your carburetor, that's content. Journalism, facts, people, sources, information, verifiable, that's in a different category, in my worldview. Journalism and content are not interchangeable. Journalism is journalism, content is content. But for a lot of consumers, they're all the same. And we haven't done enough to elevate that which is journalism, that separates itself from content. And the last point I would make is, we've been our own worst enemy. When I worked at CNN and Fox, I had the same grievance, which is, why are there so many analysts and not so many reporters? Why does a 24-hour news network have 24-hour analysts and not 24-hour reporters? I call them spout analysts. People just show up, get makeup and talk, analyze the news. Why don't we have the reporters tell people what the news is? The ratio seems to me, and always has, this is not a new grievance of mine, it's one I've had for years, why do we spend so much time analyzing the news and not having reporters talk about what they've learned? CNN, MS, Fox, you have 5 minutes of reporters and 55 minutes of analysts. Now, Ben, God bless you, you've been an analyst many times. This is not meant to disparage you or analysts who know what the hell they're talking about. Ben doesn't go on Fox as often as they ask him to go on. He goes on when he knows something about what he's asked to talk about. True? You turn him down frequently because he's not a spout animal. But plenty are. I'm tired of that. I bet you are too. And if I had a magic wand, which I don't, that's one thing I would fix. Because I think it distorts and it blurs the lines for good people like you who want to know what's news and what's analysts. We don't distinguish that at all. We blur them together relentlessly. And I don't think that serves you. And I wish we did a better job. Who's next?
Thank you for taking my question. A little bit simple, so please.
Some of those best questions are simple.
Okay, well, I look at the Clinton News Network. I also look at false news. I look at rather biased. I see all of these news outlets, and then I hear you say you're only as good as your last story. So what has happened to investigative journalists? What's happened to our institutions? Are they creating news? Are they creating polls for something for the air? Or is it an agenda from the network? I mean, I look at George Stephanopoulos, who was on the Clinton staff, and now he's on
Right.
the USA News. So I think we're being inundated from the right and the left. What's your take on some of that?
So, am I in general uncomfortable with people who were defined political actors making a career as journalists when they weren't journalists first? They were political actors first, and then they became journalists? Yeah, I'm kind of uncomfortable by that. But it happens. And there is at least some transparency. You know where George Stephanopoulos worked. You can judge him based on what he says and how you hold that against his previous life in politics. There's some transparency to that. There are plenty of people who've worked in the Trump administration who are now on Fox. You can judge them the same way. That's the same kind of revolving door. They're on news, they're analysts, they're respected, or at least theoretically respected experts, but they have a known pedigree behind them. You asked me, what's become of investigative journalism. In general, it's like a lot of American journalism been hollowed out because there's less market share. Newspapers across our great country are dying before our very eyes. Let me give you a statistic. My first job was in Amarillo, Texas, as a cop reporter. Amarillo at that time had a population of 160,000. The newspaper I worked for was called the Globe News. It had two editions. A morning edition called the Amarillo Morning News, and an afternoon edition called the Amarillo Globe Times. We had competing newsrooms, so we worked in the same building, but we competed morning staff against day staff. Two newspapers in a 160,000 population town of Amarillo. Imagine that. Two newspapers. Different circulation staffs, different advertising staffs, and different editorial staffs. Combined, 50 people, reporters, photographers, copy editors, line editors, work for the two newspapers. 50. Amarillo now has a population of 210,000. And the staff of the Amarillo Globe News is 4. 4. The editor of that newspaper is also the editor of 4 other newspapers in West Texas and spends precisely 1.5 days in the community of Amarillo. That's a glimpse of what's happening to community journalism across our country. It is shrinking and atrophying before our very eyes. So when a community can't talk to each other, and I've always believed that community newspaper is one of the best places for a community to learn about and talk to each other, whether it's the mayor or the county board or the water district or the school board, it talks to each other. It has public meetings, and the newspaper goes there. And it talks about high school football, and high school basketball, and soccer, and volleyball, and what the community is doing to raise money for this or that, or how it's responding to a crime wave. It talks to itself. It listens to itself through one place. Well, when that one place shrinks before its very eyes, not only are you not training the journalists of the future, you're not communicating to yourself in your own community about your own issues. And suddenly local issues take on an aspect of red and blue national issues, when they're not. Trust me, the National Republican Party doesn't care, or the National Democratic Party doesn't care a whit about a water district fight in any community in this country. But it seems like it when there's no reporters there to talk about it in your own local language with your own local people. That's one of the things that's happening in our country. And if I also, I'm really infatuated with this whole magic wand thing, forgive me. But if I had another magic wand, and it would be more important than the one I referred to a moment ago, it would be to tell Facebook and Google and Amazon, take some of your profits and lay down some money in every community in this country to build a foundation that will support local journalism. Unfettered, without editorial meddling, so you can sustain that which you're killing, which your market share is decimated. Because you think you can live in a country that can't talk to itself at a community basis, but guess what? You can't. And you're on a fool's errand if you think you can. And that's one of the things that I believe is kind of like a larger structural issue about where wealth is going, why it's concentrating, and what's being lost in the process, which is not incidentally a subplot of the 2016 election. Who's next? Yes, sir.
I'm curious what you think about political access, direct access to people like Twitter, constantly Twitter. That sort of circumvents journalism.
Not sort of. Completely. But that's not new. The idea of people in public office, particularly the president, trying to sidestep the entrenched, skeptical, hostile media. That's not new. I often observe that when he was president, Abraham Lincoln would send his favorite speeches directly to Republican newspaper editors. So they would publish them verbatim. So Lincoln could have his speeches published in the paper as he wrote them and as he delivered them, circumventing the entrenched Washington press corps. So that idea, that motive is not new. Social media is just much more immediate, but the fireside chats were also a way to do that for FDR. The first televised press conferences that Dwight Eisenhower had was a way of doing that. John F. Kennedy became a master of that medium for a time, and then the great master of all was Ronald Reagan in the medium of his time, network television news. I write in the book that it will be regarded 20 years from now that Donald Trump was the master of his medium of his time, social media. That's not a compliment or an attack, it's just a truism. He uses it to amplify his message more directly and more frequently, and with more resonance than anyone when he was a candidate and as president. People, I think, will try after President Trump has left office to replicate that. I don't think they will be as successful. Because Donald Trump came to the presidency as a free-form celebrity and a free-form business entity. He had two pre-existing apolitical identities. Now, maybe we're going to get in the habit of electing people who have no connection to politics. Maybe that's the one thing that Donald Trump will set in motion that will be irreversible. I don't know. If it is something that is part of the future, and we don't take political experience or military experience as something that is a necessary prerequisite for the presidency, because that's what we did with Donald Trump. First American president not to lead large numbers of combatants successfully in battle, or to have a lengthy political record of some kind that could be measured. Donald Trump had neither, and he was elected, first of his kind. Every previous president had one or the other, or a combination of both. As I say in the book, that tells us something about what our national sense of what is a prerequisite for the presidency now is. So is celebrity going to be a qualifier in the future? Near celebrity? Business acumen or assumed business acumen that has nothing to do with politics? I don't know. But even if it is, I do think there is something original, deeply original about the president's understanding of the media, as I referred to earlier. He learned and became experienced with the media in the tabloid era of the 80s and 90s in New York. He understands the media, its strengths and its many weaknesses better than anybody, better than any previous occupant of the White House. He is not cowed by the media. He is not mystified by the media. He believes he is a master manipulator of the media in ways that no previous American president has felt. Even with Ronald Reagan's success, he still felt, if you read the history of his presidency, a little unnerved and a little shaken by media appraisals of him, and particularly Nancy. Donald Trump doesn't feel any of that. And part of that is because of his social media presence and his ability to authenticate himself on an hourly basis for the country. And I mentioned to the students earlier today, I think he considers that both something he wants to protect and something he is imprisoned by. He can't not be that thing. He cannot be that non-presence. I write in the book about a conversation early in 2017 that Newt Gingrich had with Donald Trump. And Newt's a very big supporter of the president, unabashed. And he said to the president in the Oval Office, 80% of your tweets would be 100% better. Meaning if you dialed it back by 20%, you'd be so much more effective. To which Trump said, you mean 95%. Not taking the point at all, just negotiating over the percentage. I think that is deeply illustrative of his frame of mind. And then Newt said this thing, the whole point he was trying to make, it disappeared entirely, and it just became a tenacious conversation over the percentage of his Twitter brilliance. Not that he could gain so much more by being a little bit less. That was lost. And I think that's illustrative of a lot of dimensions of his approach. And you can't be one and the other. He is what he is. I mean, I tell people this all the time. What you see is exactly what it is. There's no shadow presidency. There's nothing behind the curtain. There is no curtain. Except the sense that actors walk in front of curtains. And he takes the acting part of this job and his persona very seriously. But it is what it is. There is no other part. There is only that, whether it's on social media or in his public remarks. And social media is as visceral and as authentic an expression of who President Trump is as anything. Yeah, there's a couple there.
So over like the 2 exchange years,
But just so I can hear you. Anyone else?
Over like the 2 and change years that you've covered the White House, obviously there have been a lot of comings and goings, whether that be Steve Bannon to John Kelly and currently Mick Mulvaney, and you hear about the power or the sway that people might hold behind the scenes. Who, in your experience, maybe that as it's been covered or not, has held a lot of sway in the White House and commanded power behind the scenes?
So I will say this about Vice President Pence. He's very important on the Space Council. And the Space Council is a priority of the President's, and he has placed in Vice President Pence's hands the revitalization of the Space Council, which is something that existed for many years, but it's sort of fallen into disuse during the Bush and Obama presidencies in particular. And Vice President Pence has made that a very active thing. Cabinet secretaries who are involved don't come to those meetings and nod off in the ways they used to. These are serious meetings with a serious agenda, and the President's prioritized space. He's not kidding about Space Force, and I know people and late-night comedians make fun of that. I have a podcast called The Takeout, and one of my guests recently was Neil deGrasse Tyson, a world-renowned astrophysicist. He said about that, just because Trump said it doesn't mean it's wrong, or doesn't mean it's illogical. Space Force is an important construct. What we do commercially depends enormously on the workability and dependability of satellites in the air. Where else would they be, Major? Satellites. And asking the governmental question, do we need to have a different bureaucracy that's focused only on what is there, what is going to be there, and how it's protected, and how it relates to our daily life commercially, whether it's our ATM transactions, to our cell phone usage, or the interoperability of our communication systems, or everything else. Neil deGrasse Tyson said, yes, we need to do that. I'm not sure the Space Force is the precise answer, but he's asking a really important question. Just because Trump asked it doesn't make it necessarily fodder for late-night comedians. And the Vice President has been enormously influential in not only identifying Space Force and the space questions, but this idea about going to the moon and then to Mars. And telling NASA that you're either going to do it or we're going to sideswipe you and we're going to use commercial rocket builders to make that progress to the moon and then use that as a stepping off point to Mars. So that's one place where I can say with specificity and absolute confidence, the president has delegated, and someone that you might not think of as being super influential has been in a particular area. It will come as a surprise to no one in this room that Stephen Miller has been supremely influential on immigration policy. That's not a newsflash. He has built a bureaucracy within the federal government at DHS and every relevant agency of people who are like-minded about enforcing existing laws and taking the most American sovereign, meaning the sovereignty of America attitude toward every single question about immigration. And many find that unduly restrictive. Many Trump supporters find it perfectly commonsensical. But either way, Stephen Miller has been enormously influential and supremely effective. I really can't identify for you anyone else who's been really, really structurally significant, because almost every cabinet secretary has had people beneath them come and go, as have cabinet secretaries come and go. One thing I would say in general about the president's approach to his leadership and setting priorities is he leaves his cabinet secretaries alone, except when they get bad press and then he fires them. But he delegates to cabinet secretaries and empowers cabinet secretaries in ways no president I've ever covered has. Most presidents, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, made cabinet secretaries deeply subservient to the White House, structurally, in every way. This president does not. And you might be encouraged to know, or you might be horrified to know, I'll leave it up to you, that his cabinet meetings are real cabinet meetings. After the press is gone, there's a real accountability session with everyone around there, and the things last discussed in the most previous cabinet meeting are rerun. And whatever your agenda didn't have accomplished the last time, it better be accomplished this time. So cabinet secretaries are empowered by this president in a way that's more reminiscent of presidencies in the 60s and 70s. As a student of government, I find that interesting, because I do believe our government ought to function more like that, with autonomous cabinet secretaries that are not indifferent to the White House, but have their own sense of mission, know their agencies, and carry out the president's agenda without a lot of White House micromanagement, if you will. And I think that's an aspect of the Trump presidency that's not as well understood because so much else is going on. But if you want to ask yourself, why is the deregulatory agenda, for example, been as aggressive, it's because the president has given very specific orders and told his cabinet secretaries to pursue those agenda items relentlessly and let them do it. And that's the kind of autonomy that most cabinet secretaries have not had for the past 20 or 30 years. Who's next? Right over here.
You had talked about sort of the 4 key takeaways, things that we're going to live with.
Yeah, at least 4. There are others, but at least 4.
But if you had the opportunity to write that chapter on trade right now,
Yeah.
what would sort of the theme be?
What would I say about trade? I would say the president's called the question in a way that no previous president I've covered ever has. I was telling the classes earlier today that my first presidential campaign, being the first one I covered, not the first one I voted in or observed, but the first one I actually covered as a reporter, was 1992. And I remember listening to Bill Clinton assail George Herbert Walker Bush for kowtowing to China all the time. And it was a great applause line, and it helped him, not structurally, there are a lot of other issues, but it was a line of attack against George Herbert Walker Bush that had some resonance. And then Bill Clinton, as president, did everything that George Herbert Walker Bush did with China. Didn't change things at all. China's been a recurrent theme in almost every presidential campaign I've covered. Kvetching, bitching, screaming, assailing, and doing nothing. Well, President Trump has done something. He's called the question. What are you doing and why? And we don't like it, and we're going to tariff you in exchange for that. We're going to get your attention. Where it's all landing, I don't know. We don't know yet. But we know, I know, the country knows, the world knows, that China's attention has been captured. China now cares about this economic relationship. Has it changed fundamentally its behavior? No. Is it more willing to discuss mechanisms by which it might change its behavior? Yes. That in itself is a difference. A fundamental difference. The president also doesn't like multilateral trade negotiations. He wants one-on-one trade negotiations, deeply transactional. This for that, me for you, nobody else. I'm not going to balance your interest against this other country or this other country over here. You and me, that's it. Because that way I know exactly what I'm giving up and exactly what I'm getting. That's his frame of mind. So he's renegotiated the South Korea trade deal. He's renegotiated a new deal with Japan. He has created the after effect, the second NAFTA, if you will. USMCA renamed bears a lot of relationship to the original NAFTA, but it is improved in certain respects, and it has clarified things about future economic relations of the two countries. So I would say about trade, what was unresolved for almost a year and a half became resolved because of one person. Trump let his people argue about it for a year and a half and finally said, I'm sick of it. I'm doing this and you're all falling in line. And I don't care anymore because you argued for a year and a half and got me nowhere. I'm declaring this, I'm tariffing, and I'm going to see what, he loves his phrase. We'll see what happens. He really wants to call this economic question in a way that hasn't been called before. So it is original, it is different, it is structurally creating a new conversation. We don't know the ultimate effects, but we do know that though the markets have wobbled, they've mostly remained resilient. He's not ending relationships, he's not cutting things off, but he is trying to change the terms of transaction in a way that I've seen no previous president try to accomplish. So in that way, he is plainly and visibly original. I don't know if that will address the underlying issues of employment or manufacturing. There's plenty of statistical data that suggests that automation has gobbled up far more jobs than trade and equity. And automation is not stopping. Don't kid yourself, automation is not stopping. There are companies in our country that are spending hours and hours and hours every day trying to figure out how robotics and artificial intelligence will replace workers across the spectrum of the economy. And not just blue-collar workers, white-collar workers, lawyers, cardiologists, people who analyze data, traders on Wall Street. How you automate that and make that more reliable and less costly and less subject to healthcare costs, showing up late, being hungover, whatever. That process is continuing. And that's not part of the trade conversation. Trade is about what we give and take in goods and services, but how we actually produce things and make things is about artificial intelligence and robotics. And those forces, those trends, are as much about our economic future as the trade one. So I would say about trade, all the things I said, original, bold, calling questions, fundamentally changing the conversation, but is it taking into account this other set of forces that may be more meaningful to the future of manufacturing in America than anything in the trade equation? I'm not sure. I have my doubts. Who's next?
Why don't we just take one last question here, and then Mr. Garrett's going to be so gracious as to sign some books right
Yes.
out front here.
Yes. Yes, ma'am. You get the last one.
If you were invited to come to the White House for a personal conference with the president, and he said, what 3 areas do you think I need to work on? What would you tell?
That's a great question. I would tell the president what my wife tells me. My wife has a PhD in political science. She studied the American presidency for most of her professional life. She has a beautiful phrase, which is the presidency is the mood music of our country. How the president talks gives us a sense of how we hear ourselves and how the lilt of the American experiment flows through our consciousness. She's not only a political scientist, she has a bit of a poet in her. And I would tell the president that's really important, and you devalue that, not only at your expense, but the expense of the country. Because our country is trained to listen to our president and to rise and fall on the emotional bandwidth of our president. We're taught that. from a very early age. We take our cues from that. You discount that, Mr. President, at your personal political peril and at the peril of the country. Because things are not as tumultuous as you make them sound. Think about it. The Trump presidency, by any external set of measurements, has been tranquil. No terrorist attacks, no massive economic disruption. Even our storms have been dealable. We can handle it. By any standard measurement of what is a tumultuous time in American history, externally, these have been placid times. Do they feel placid? No. Why? Because the presidency is the mood music of our country. And it's too loud. It's too loud. It's the first thing I would tell him. Second thing I would tell him is, you have a belief about your political destiny that is related to your base. You have a greater political destiny if you add to your base. He believes he has a political weakness if he adds to his base. How many in this audience remember the film The American President? Raise your hand. Michael Jackson, Michael Douglas. Michael Douglas and Annette Bening. Remember that movie? What was one of the subplots in that movie? Michael Douglas, the president, was at 66 in the polls, mid to high 60s. He starts dating Annette Bening, his poll numbers begin to collapse. He falls to 45. It's a crisis for the president. They're polling incessantly. They're trying to figure out, why is he falling? This is a crisis for the presidency. He's losing the country. 65 to 45. That is a subplot that has never existed for one split second in the Trump presidency. Not one. 45. You think they polled the White House? What would they poll? We spent $3 million to find out he's moved from 42.1 to 43.1.5. There's no question there. He believes that anything about his base that departs from it injures him. And I would say, no, Mr. President, actually, you're in this unique position. You command this great authority. You command this great institution. You can actually pull people toward you if you try. And when you do, other things are possible. You are frustrated about things that are not possible. One of the great challenges and one of the great inducements of politics is to change that which exists. I'm here. The political forces arraying me are here. I want to get over there. How do I take me and everyone who's against me over here? We've done it 100 times in our life, in our politics. Presidents do it all the time. But it takes effort, it takes maneuvering, it takes a certain amount of humility. It takes a certain amount of giving up of yourself and your self-identity to pour yourself into the grievances or aspirations of people who disagree with you. I would say that, Mr. President, that's possible. You have that possibility. Again, like the first thing I just told you, you disdain that. You disdain it, and by doing so, you make yourself weaker than you otherwise should be. I wouldn't have another thing. I'd stop right there. If I got all that out of my mouth, I would consider that a massive, massive victory. You guys are wonderful. Thank you for being here. I'm honored by your presence.